Picture this. It's a crisp autumn morning in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The air smells of pine and earth. Leaves are turning gold and crimson. It's the kind of day that draws people to western North Carolina, the kind of day that promises peace and beauty. But what if that beauty was hiding something sinister? What if those ancient mountains, standing silent for millions of years, were concealing a truth so disturbing it would shake an entire community to its core? In September of 2001, a young woman named Sarah Morrison walked into the Pisgah National Forest near Asheville, North Carolina. She was an experienced hiker, familiar with every trail, every turn, every overlook. She was supposed to be back by nightfall. She never returned. For 22 years, her disappearance remained one of western North Carolina's most baffling cold cases. No body, no evidence, no answers, just silence from the mountains. Then, in the summer of 2023, something impossible happened. Deep within an uncharted cave system, miles from any known trail, explorers detected a signal. A repeating electromagnetic pulse, emanating from the darkness, calling out like a ghost from the past. When investigators finally reached the source, what they discovered would crack open this cold case in the most unexpected way imaginable, leading to an arrest that shocked the community and revealed that someone they had trusted had been hiding a monstrous secret all along. This is the story of how technology, persistence, and one bizarre clue buried deep in the earth finally brought justice for Sarah Morrison. This is the story of a cold case solved in the most extraordinary way. Let me take you back to where it all began. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison. Remember that name because by the end of the story, you'll understand why it matters so much to so many people. 24 years old in the autumn of 2001. Born and raised in Asheville, Sarah was the daughter of two public school teachers, Michael and Patricia Morrison. She had one younger brother, Daniel, who was 20 at the time of her disappearance. By all accounts, Sarah was one of those people who seemed to embody the spirit of the mountains she called home. Creative, adventurous, deeply connected to the natural world around her. Sarah worked part-time at a local art gallery on Biltmore Avenue in downtown Asheville while pursuing her passion as a landscape painter. Her friends described her work as capturing the soul of the Appalachians. She had a particular gift for painting light, the way it filtered through morning mist in the valleys, the way it set the mountainsides ablaze at sunset. Local collectors were beginning to take notice of her talent. Several of her pieces had sold at the gallery, and she'd been invited to participate in a juried show scheduled for November of that year. Her artistic career was just beginning to take flight. But painting wasn't Sarah's only passion. She was an avid hiker, certified in wilderness first aid, and had completed dozens of trails throughout the Pisgah and Nantahala national forests. She wasn't a casual weekend warrior. Sarah kept detailed hiking journals, noting trail conditions, weather patterns, and the behaviors of wildlife she encountered. She respected the wilderness, understood its dangers, and prepared accordingly. Her backpack always contained more than enough supplies, emergency gear, and a laminated topographical map of whatever area she planned to explore. Her roommate at the time, Jessica Chen, remembered Sarah as methodical about her outdoor adventures. Sarah wasn't reckless. Jessica would later tell investigators. She always told me exactly where she was going, what trail she'd be on, and when I should expect her back. If she said 6 o'clock, she meant 6 o'clock. She was like clockwork. Those who knew Sarah also remembered her warmth, her infectious laugh, and her genuine interest in other people's lives. She volunteered at the Asheville Humane Society on weekends, fostering dogs that needed temporary homes. She organized art classes for underprivileged children at the community center. She was, by every measure, a young woman contributing positively to her community, someone with a bright future stretching out before her like the mountain trails she loved to explore. In early September 2001, Sarah had been planning what she called her autumn inspiration trip. The changing leaves were approaching peak color, and she wanted to capture specific locations at specific times of day when the light would be perfect for her paintings. She had sketched out an ambitious schedule of hikes over several weeks, each one carefully chosen for its artistic potential. September 15th was supposed to be one of the shorter trips on her list. The Big Ivy area, north of Asheville, offered stunning views of the Blue Ridge Parkway and was known for its accessible trails and relatively gentle terrain. For someone of Sarah's experience, it was practically a walk in the park. She planned to reach a particular overlook by mid-afternoon, sketch for a few hours, and return before dark. Simple, routine, safe. She woke up early that Saturday morning, excited about the trip. Jessica remembered her making coffee, humming to herself as she packed her art supplies into her worn green backpack. She was in such a good mood, Jessica recalled. She showed me her sketching kit, told me she had a feeling she was going to create something special that day. She said, "I'll be back by 6 and I'll cook dinner. I'm thinking pasta." Those were the last words she ever said to me. Sarah left their apartment around 8:30 that morning, driving her blue Honda Civic toward the mountains. She had her hiking boots, her art supplies, plenty of water, energy bars, a fully charged cell phone, and that meticulous preparation that characterized everything she did. According to the timeline investigators would later establish, she arrived at the Big Ivy Trailhead parking area around 9:15. Several other hikers were in the parking lot that morning, and 2 of them would later confirm seeing Sarah's car. One witness, an elderly couple from Florida, even remembered seeing a young woman matching Sarah's description, adjusting her backpack near a blue Honda. "She looked happy," the wife would tell police. "She waved at us. We waved back. Then we headed out on our hike, and that was that." That was the last confirmed sighting of Sarah Morrison alive. 24 years old, experienced hiker, perfect weather, familiar territory. Everything should have been fine. Everything should have been routine. But sometimes the mountains have other plans. Or rather, sometimes someone hiding in those mountains has other plans. 6 o'clock came and went. Sarah didn't come home. Jessica Chun remembered looking at the clock, then at the window, then back at the clock. 6:15, 6:30. She tried Sarah's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. That wasn't necessarily alarming. Cell service in the mountains was notoriously spotty. Maybe Sarah had lost track of time while painting. Maybe she'd decided to catch the sunset and was running a bit late. Jessica started preparing dinner anyway, expecting to hear Sarah's key in the door at any moment. 7 o'clock. Still nothing. Now Jessica was getting worried. She called Sarah's parents. Michael Morrison tried to sound reassuring, but Jessica could hear the concern creeping into his voice. "Give it another hour," he suggested. "You know how Sarah gets when she's focused on her art. She probably found the perfect view and lost track of time." 8 o'clock. Darkness had fallen over Asheville. Sarah's cell phone was still going straight to voicemail. Michael and Patricia Morrison were now at Jessica's apartment, and the 3 of them were trying to decide what to do. Call the police? Wait until morning? What if Sarah had simply decided to camp overnight and they raised a false alarm? But that didn't make sense. Sarah hadn't packed camping gear. She'd specifically said this was a day hike. And Sarah was never late, never forgot to call, never left people wondering where she was. Something was wrong. They all felt it, that cold dread settling in their stomachs like a stone. At 8:45 p.m. on September 15th, 2001, Michael Morrison called the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office to report his daughter missing. The deputy who took the call was professional but not immediately alarmed. Missing hiker reports were common in western North Carolina, and the vast majority of them resolved within hours. The hiker had gotten turned around, or their car had broken down, or they twisted an ankle and were making their way slowly back to the trailhead. The deputy took down all the relevant information. Sarah's description, what she was wearing, her vehicle information, the specific trail she'd planned to hike. "We'll send a deputy to check the parking area," the deputy assured Michael. "If her car is still there, we'll initiate a search at first light. Chances are good she's just gotten disoriented and bedded down for the night. Happens more often than you'd think." But Michael Morrison knew his daughter. Sarah didn't get disoriented. Sarah didn't make mistakes in the wilderness. Sarah was careful, prepared, experienced. The knot of fear in his chest tightened. A patrol deputy drove out to the Big Ivy Trailhead that night, arriving around 10:30 p.m. Sarah's blue Honda Civic was exactly where she'd parked it that morning, now alone in the empty lot. The deputy swept the area with a flashlight, calling Sarah's name into the darkness. Nothing. Just the sound of wind through the pines and the distant hoot of an owl. The vehicle was locked. The deputy peered through the windows with his flashlight. Nothing appeared disturbed. Sarah's car registration was visible in the glove compartment. A few CDs were scattered on the passenger seat. Everything looked normal, which somehow made everything feel more ominous. The deputy radioed in his findings. Sarah Morrison's vehicle had been located at the trailhead, but there was no sign of Sarah herself. A search and rescue operation would commence at dawn. That night was the longest night of the Morrison family's life. Patricia Morrison would later describe it as living in a nightmare you can't wake up from. Every possible scenario ran through their minds. Maybe Sarah had fallen and broken her leg. Maybe she'd gotten hypothermia. Maybe she'd encountered a bear. Maybe. But none of those maybes explained why an experienced hiker on an easy, well-marked trail hadn't made it back. Dawn broke over the Blue Ridge Mountains on September 16th, bringing with it an army of searchers. The Buncombe County Sheriff's Office coordinated with the National Park Service and the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. Search and rescue volunteers from 3 counties responded to the call. By 7 a.m., more than 60 people were assembled at the Big Ivy Trailhead, organizing into teams, studying topographical maps, planning their grid search patterns. Among those volunteers was a 40-year-old electronics technician named Robert Caldwell, though everyone called him Eli. He was known in local hiking circles as an experienced outdoorsman and cave explorer. He'd volunteered for search and rescue operations before, and his knowledge of the area's hidden terrain was considered valuable. Nobody suspected that Eli Caldwell might know more about Sarah Morrison's disappearance than he was letting on. Nobody imagined that he was already playing a role in what would become one of the region's most disturbing crimes. The search teams fanned out across the Big Ivy area, calling Sarah's name, looking for any sign of her passage. The weather was cooperating: clear skies, good visibility, moderate temperatures. If Sarah had bivouacked somewhere, she should be able to hear them and respond. If she was injured, they should be able to find her. They found nothing. No torn clothing snagged on branches. No dropped water bottle. No footprints veering off the established trail. No trampled vegetation suggesting someone had pushed through the underbrush. It was as if Sarah Morrison had simply vanished into thin air somewhere between the parking lot and her intended destination. Dogs were brought in, bloodhounds trained to follow human scent. They picked up Sarah's trail from her car, followed it along the main path for approximately half a mile, then abruptly lost it. The handlers found this deeply puzzling. Dogs didn't just lose scent unless there was a reason. The person had gotten into a vehicle, crossed a stream, or somehow their trail had been deliberately obscured. But there were no vehicle tracks on the trail, no nearby streams in that section, and no evidence of anyone trying to hide their tracks. The dogs circled the area where they'd lost the scent, whining and confused, unable to pick it back up in any direction. It made no sense. This is where the case started to take on an eerie, almost supernatural quality in the minds of those involved. Experienced search and rescue personnel will tell you that people don't simply vanish. There's always evidence, always a trail, always something. But in Sarah Morrison's case, there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. The wilderness had swallowed her completely, leaving behind not even a whisper of her passage. The search continued for 5 days. Helicopters equipped with infrared cameras swept the area, looking for heat signatures. Technical climbers checked difficult-to-reach cliff faces and rock formations. Cave rescue teams explored known cave systems in the region, thinking perhaps Sarah had fallen into an undiscovered sinkhole or opening. Every hour that passed decreased the likelihood of finding Sarah alive, but nobody wanted to say that out loud. Hope was all the Morrison family had left. By September 21st, the active search was scaled back. The area had been thoroughly covered multiple times. If Sarah was out there, she would have been found. The grim reality was settling in. Either Sarah had somehow traveled far beyond the expected search radius, or something more sinister had occurred. The case officially became a missing person investigation, and the questions shifted from, "Where is she?" to, "What happened to her?" And those questions would haunt western North Carolina for the next 22 years. Detective Marcus Reynolds of the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office took lead on the Morrison case. A 15-year veteran with experience in missing persons investigations, Reynolds approached the case methodically, starting with the basics and working outward. First question: had Sarah Morrison disappeared voluntarily? Was there any evidence she wanted to leave her life behind? The answer was a resounding no. Sarah's bank accounts showed normal activity up to the day of her disappearance, with no large withdrawals or suspicious transactions. Her apartment contained all her possessions, including her passport, birth certificate, and social security card. Her art supplies, her most precious possessions, were still in her studio space. Her family insisted she was happy, looking forward to her upcoming gallery show, excited about her developing career. There was no boyfriend drama, no financial stress, no indication whatsoever that Sarah wanted to start a new life somewhere else. Second question: had Sarah encountered some kind of accident or medical emergency in the wilderness? This seemed possible, but the extensive search had turned up nothing. If Sarah had fallen, broken a leg, suffered a heart attack, or experienced any kind of medical crisis, her body should have been found in the searched area. The grid search had been thorough, professional, and covered far more ground than a solo day hiker could have reasonably covered. Still, Detective Reynolds knew that the Pisgah National Forest covered over 500,000 acres. A person could conceivably be lost in that vastness, never to be found. Third question: had Sarah been the victim of foul play? This was the possibility that kept Detective Reynolds up at night. But if Sarah had been abducted or harmed by another person, there should be evidence. Witnesses would have seen suspicious vehicles or individuals at the trailhead. There would have been signs of a struggle. The dogs would have picked up scent trails indicating Sarah had been moved or carried. Yet there was none of that, just the mystifying point where her trail simply ended, as if she'd been plucked off the face of the earth. Detective Reynolds interviewed everyone who'd been at the Big Ivy Trailhead on September 15th. The elderly couple from Florida who'd seen Sarah in the parking lot. 2 college students who'd hiked the area that afternoon. A family of 4 who'd picnicked at an overlook. Several solo hikers who'd been on various trails in the area. Each interview was documented, each person's timeline verified. One of those interviews was with Robert Eli Caldwell, the electronics technician who'd volunteered with the search effort. Caldwell explained that he'd heard about the search on the local news and wanted to help. He was an experienced caver and hiker, familiar with the area's terrain, including some of the lesser-known cave systems and rock formations that the average hiker would never encounter. "I hoped I could help find her," Caldwell told Detective Reynolds during their October 2001 interview. "It's terrible what happened. I've hiked that area dozens of times. It's not a dangerous trail. I can't understand how someone just disappears like that." Detective Reynolds noted Caldwell's apparent sincerity and thanked him for his volunteer efforts. There was no reason to suspect Caldwell of anything. He'd been cooperative, helpful, and seemed genuinely disturbed by Sarah's disappearance. Like dozens of other volunteers, he was simply a concerned citizen trying to help. The detective moved on to other leads. Those other leads, unfortunately, went nowhere. The investigation examined whether Sarah might have been targeted by a serial predator. The National Park Service and FBI were consulted about similar cases in the region. While there had been other disappearances in national forests across the country over the years, none fit a clear pattern that would suggest a single perpetrator. Each case seemed isolated, explicable by natural causes or misadventure. Detective Reynolds looked into known sex offenders living in Buncombe County and surrounding areas. Several were brought in for questioning, their alibis checked, their activities on September 15th scrutinized. All were cleared. None had any connection to Sarah Morrison or the Big Ivy area. The detective examined Sarah's personal life in exhaustive detail. Ex-boyfriends were interviewed. Friends were questioned about whether Sarah had mentioned anyone making her uncomfortable, following her, or showing unwanted interest. Art gallery colleagues were asked if any customers or visitors had seemed overly interested in Sarah or her work. Every angle was explored. One lead seemed promising briefly. A gallery employee remembered a man who'd come in several times over the summer, always spending a long time looking at Sarah's paintings, asking questions about her inspirations and techniques. The employee described him as quiet, maybe mid to late 50s, with graying hair and glasses. He'd purchased one of Sarah's smaller pieces in August, paying cash. Detective Reynolds worked with a sketch artist to create a composite based on the gallery employee's description. The sketch was distributed to media outlets and posted in public spaces throughout Asheville. Tips came in, identifying various men who vaguely resembled the sketch, but none led anywhere substantive. Without a name or more specific information, the lead evaporated. As autumn turned to winter and winter turned to spring, the active investigation wound down. Detective Reynolds kept the case file on his desk, reviewing it regularly, hoping for some new piece of information to emerge. But none did. Sarah Morrison had vanished into the mountains, and the mountains weren't giving up their secrets. The Morrison family refused to give up. Michael and Patricia established the Sarah Morrison Memorial Fund, offering a $10,000 reward for information leading to their daughter's whereabouts. They organized annual searches on the anniversary of Sarah's disappearance, bringing together volunteers to hike the Big Ivy area and surrounding regions, hoping to spot some clue the initial search had missed. Patricia Morrison became active in missing persons advocacy, connecting with other families experiencing similar tragedies. She appeared on local news programs, keeping Sarah's case in the public eye, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. "Someone knows something," she would say, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "Someone has information that could bring Sarah home. Please, if you know anything at all, call the tip line." But the calls that came in were well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful. Suppose psychics claimed to have visions of where Sarah's body could be found. Armchair detectives spun elaborate theories based on nothing but speculation. A few cruel hoaxers called with false information, causing the family's hopes to rise and then crash. The signal-to-noise ratio was abysmal. Detective Reynolds retired in 2008, handing the Morrison case over to his successor. Before he left, he sat down with Michael and Patricia Morrison one last time. "I'm sorry I couldn't find your daughter," he told them, and the emotion in his voice was genuine. "I think about her case all the time. I think about what I might have missed, what lead I should have pursued more aggressively. I'm sorry." Patricia Morrison had taken his hand. "You did everything you could," she'd said. "We know that. We're grateful for everything you tried." The case file moved to the cold case section of the archives. Sarah Morrison's disappearance joined hundreds of other unsolved cases, mysteries that might never be answered, families who might never find closure. But here's something you need to understand about cold cases. They're never really cold. They're just waiting for technology to catch up, waiting for someone's conscience to crack, waiting for one small detail, overlooked in the initial investigation, to suddenly snap into focus with new context. Sarah Morrison's case was waiting for something impossible, a signal from deep underground. 22 years is a long time. Think about what changes in 22 years. Children are born and graduate from college. Technology transforms from primitive to revolutionary. Entire careers begin and end. The world turns, life goes on, and gradually, inevitably, people forget. But the Morrison family never forgot. They couldn't forget. How do you forget your daughter, your sister, the person whose absence leaves a hole in your life that nothing can fill? Sarah's brother, Daniel, graduated from college, got married, had 2 children of his own. He named his daughter Sarah, after the aunt she would never meet. "I wanted to make sure she was remembered," Daniel explained in a 2015 interview with the Asheville Citizen-Times. "I wanted my children to know about their aunt, about who she was, what she meant to our family. I didn't want her to just become a sad story, a cautionary tale. She was a real person, a wonderful person, and she deserved to be remembered for more than how she disappeared." Patricia Morrison kept Sarah's room exactly as it had been. Her paintings still hung on the walls. Her hiking boots still sat in the closet. Her sketchbooks remained on the desk, the last few pages showing her preparations for that final, fateful trip. Friends gently suggested that perhaps it was time to let go, to pack things away, to accept that Sarah was gone. Patricia refused. "She's not gone," she would insist. "She's missing. There's a difference. And until we know what happened to her, until we find her, I'm not changing anything." Michael Morrison became quieter over the years, the weight of grief settling into his bones. He retired from teaching in 2010, unable to muster the energy and enthusiasm the job required. He spent his retirement researching missing persons cases, following developments in forensic science and search technology, hoping that some advancement might provide new avenues for finding Sarah. He maintained a detailed website about Sarah's case, updating it regularly with new information, theories, and appeals for help. The Asheville community, too, kept Sarah's memory alive. Local artists donated pieces to annual memorial shows, with proceeds going to missing persons organizations. Hikers left small tokens at the Big Ivy Trailhead, painted rocks, flowers, handwritten notes, creating an informal memorial that grew over the years. Sarah's story became part of the local lore, told around campfires and in online forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries. But as the years passed, the harsh reality set in. Sarah Morrison's case might never be solved. Despite the family's efforts, despite the community's support, despite periodic reviews of the case file by new investigators, no new evidence emerged. The case remained frustratingly, heartbreakingly stuck. In 2012, advances in ground-penetrating radar technology led to a renewed search of the Big Ivy area. Investigators theorized that perhaps Sarah had fallen into an undiscovered cave opening or sinkhole, something that would have been missed by the initial search. The radar survey covered a wide area, looking for underground voids or anomalies that might indicate a collapsed cave system. Several interesting geological formations were identified and explored. None contained any trace of Sarah Morrison. In 2017, genealogical DNA technology was making headlines, solving cold cases through genetic genealogy and DNA phenotyping. The Morrison family submitted DNA samples to several databases, hoping that if Sarah's remains were ever found, or if any biological evidence existed somewhere, it could be matched. But without a body, without any physical evidence, DNA technology was useless. You can't match what you don't have. The case underwent periodic reviews, as all cold cases do. New detectives would take fresh looks at the evidence, re-interview witnesses, follow up on tips that came in sporadically. Each review reached the same frustrating conclusion: insufficient evidence to determine what happened to Sarah Morrison. The case remained classified as a missing person investigation with suspected foul play, but without evidence, suspects, or leads. Theories proliferated in online communities dedicated to unsolved mysteries. Some believed Sarah had encountered a predator, someone who'd carefully covered their tracks and hidden her body where it would never be found. Others theorized she'd somehow gotten disoriented despite her experience, wandered off trail, and succumbed to the elements in an area that hadn't been thoroughly searched. A few suggested she'd been the victim of human trafficking, smuggled out of the area and lost in the vast underground network of exploitation. Some even proposed she'd disappeared voluntarily, though the evidence strongly contradicted this. The truth is, without evidence, all theories are equally speculative. Investigators prefer evidence to theories, facts to speculation. And the facts in Sarah Morrison's case were maddeningly sparse. Meanwhile, life went on for others touched by the case. Detective Marcus Reynolds, retired, occasionally thought about Sarah Morrison on sleepless nights. The elderly couple from Florida who'd waved at Sarah that last morning sometimes wondered if they should have struck up a conversation, delayed her departure, somehow changed the course of events. Jessica Chen, Sarah's former roommate, moved away from Asheville but kept a photograph of Sarah on her desk wherever she went, a reminder of the friend she'd lost. And Robert Eli Caldwell? He continued his quiet life in a small house on the outskirts of Asheville. He worked as an electronics technician, maintained his hobbies of hiking and caving, kept to himself. Neighbors considered him a bit odd but harmless. He was the guy who could fix your computer or troubleshoot your satellite dish. He was a loner, sure, but lots of people preferred solitude. Nobody suspected that behind his unremarkable exterior, Caldwell was harboring a terrible secret. Because here's what nobody knew. Caldwell hadn't just admired Sarah Morrison's artwork. He'd become obsessed with her. He'd carefully studied her habits, her hiking patterns, her regular routes. He'd used his extensive knowledge of the area's hidden cave systems to plan something unthinkable. And he'd successfully executed that plan, hiding evidence so thoroughly that 2 decades of investigation hadn't uncovered it. Caldwell had made one crucial mistake, though. In his elaborate scheme, he'd planted something he thought would never be found. A device meant to serve a purpose that seemed clever at the time but would ultimately become his undoing. That device was patiently waiting in the darkness, broadcasting its subtle signal, undetected and ignored, until the summer of 2023, when everything changed. Because sometimes the mountains do give up their secrets. Sometimes technology catches up with crime. Sometimes justice, delayed for decades, finally finds its way home. June 2023. A team of geological explorers from the University of North Carolina were conducting a survey of unmapped areas in the Pisgah National Forest. Their project was part of a broader effort to document the region's extensive but largely uncharted cave systems, using LiDAR technology and electromagnetic scanning to identify underground voids and formations. The team consisted of Dr. Amanda Reeves, a geological sciences professor, and 3 graduate students. Jamal Thornton, who specialized in speleology, Sophie Nakamura, an expert in electromagnetic surveying, and Marcus Webb, who handled the LiDAR mapping equipment. They were working in an area roughly 4 miles northeast of the Big Ivy Trailhead, deep in terrain that most recreational hikers never accessed. It was rugged, dense with vegetation, and required technical skill to navigate. The team had been out for 3 days, camping on site and methodically surveying grid sections of the forest floor. On June 7th, Sophie Nakamura picked up something odd on her electromagnetic scanner. It was a low-frequency signal, regular and repeating, emanating from somewhere underground. At first, she thought it might be interference from nearby radio towers or electrical infrastructure, but when she checked her topographical maps, there was nothing in the area. No cell towers, no power lines, no human infrastructure of any kind. "Dr. Reeves," Sophie called out, her voice tight with confusion. "You need to look at this. I'm getting a signal and it shouldn't be here." Dr. Reeves examined the scanner readings. The signal was weak but distinct, pulsing at regular intervals. Its frequency was in the extremely low range between 3 and 30 Hz, the kind of frequency that could penetrate rock and soil. But ELF signals required significant power and sophisticated equipment. What would be generating such a signal in the middle of the wilderness? Could it be geological? Jamal suggested. Some kind of natural electromagnetic phenomenon? "I've never seen natural EM activity present this way," Dr. Reeves replied, frowning at the display. "It's too regular, too consistent. This looks artificial." The team spent the rest of the day triangulating the signal's source. By late afternoon, they'd pinpointed it to a specific area, a rocky outcropping partially hidden by dense rhododendron growth. Marcus Webb's LiDAR scan revealed what they'd hoped to find: a void beneath the surface, indicating a cave entrance. It took them another hour to locate the actual opening. It was small, partially obscured by fallen logs and vegetation, the kind of cave entrance that could easily be overlooked by anyone not specifically looking for it. Jamal, the experienced caver, prepared to make an initial descent. "Be careful," Dr. Reeves cautioned. "We don't know what's down there or how stable it is." Jamal descended into the darkness, his headlamp cutting through the black. The cave opened into a narrow passage that sloped downward at a steep angle. He had to crawl in places, squeeze through tight sections, use all his technical caving skills. The passage twisted and turned, going deeper than he'd expected. After about 30 minutes of careful progress, the passage opened into a larger chamber. Jamal swept his headlamp around, taking in the space. It was a naturally formed chamber, roughly circular, with a ceiling about 15 feet high. Stalactites hung down like stone icicles. The floor was uneven, scattered with rocks and debris. And then his light caught something that didn't belong. Something artificial. Something that made his blood run cold. There, attached to the cave wall about 7 feet up, was a device. A black metal box, roughly the size of a car battery, with a small antenna extending from it. Wires ran from the box to what appeared to be a battery pack secured to the rock. The device was covered in dust and mineral deposits, clearly having been there for a very long time. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. Next to the device, deliberately placed on a small ledge, was a piece of jewelry. A bracelet, silver, tarnished with age, but clearly visible in his headlamp's beam. Jamal's hands were shaking as he keyed his radio. "Dr. Reeves, you need to contact the authorities. Right now. I think I just found evidence of a crime." What Jamal Thornton had discovered would set off a chain of events that would finally crack the Sarah Morrison case wide open. Within hours, the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office was on scene. The current lead detective on cold cases, Detective Sarah Chun, no relation to Sarah Morrison's former roommate, coordinated with forensic specialists and cave rescue technicians to secure and investigate the site. The cave entrance was immediately sealed off as a crime scene. A careful, methodical exploration of the chamber was planned. Nothing could be touched or moved until everything had been photographed, measured, and documented. Evidence response teams prepared their equipment for the challenging underground environment. The next morning, June 8th, Detective Chun led a team of forensic specialists into the cave. The descent was arduous, the passage claustrophobic and technically challenging, but everyone understood the potential significance of what they were doing. If this was connected to an unsolved case, every detail mattered. In the chamber, forensic photographer Daniel Martinez documented everything with meticulous care. Hundreds of photographs from every conceivable angle, establishing the context and position of every element in the space. The device on the wall, the bracelet, the chamber itself, all captured in extraordinary detail. Once photography was complete, the bracelet was carefully removed and bagged as evidence. Even before it was examined in the lab, Detective Chun had a feeling she knew what it was. She'd reviewed every cold case file in the county within the past year, and one case in particular had haunted her. Sarah Morrison, missing since 2001. The bracelet matched the description of one Sarah had been known to wear. Silver with a distinctive engraving pattern. But they'd need confirmation, and that meant contacting the Morrison family. The device was more complex. Couldn't be removed immediately without detailed examination. Electronic forensic specialists studied it in place, taking measurements, analyzing its components. What they found was both fascinating and disturbing. The device was a low-frequency transmitter, sophisticated for its era but using components that dated back to the late 1990s or early 2000s. It was powered by a large battery pack, the kind used in marine applications or backup power systems, designed to provide power for extended periods. After more than 2 decades, the batteries were nearly depleted, but still functioning, still powering the transmitter's weak but steady signal. But why? What was the purpose of placing a transmitter in a remote cave chamber? The answer would come from understanding how the device had been used, and that required technical expertise beyond basic crime scene investigation. Detective Chun reached out to Dr. Howard Mitchell, a professor of electrical engineering at NC State who consulted on forensic cases. Dr. Mitchell examined photographs and video of the device, studied the technical specifications the team had been able to determine, and rendered his expert opinion. "This is an extremely low-frequency transmitter," Dr. Mitchell explained over a video call. "ELF signals have very specific applications. They can penetrate rock, soil, water, materials that block higher frequency signals. They were used in military applications for submarine communication, among other things. In a civilian context, they've been used for underground communication in mines. So someone could use this to communicate through solid rock?" Detective Chun asked. "Theoretically, yes. More likely, though, this was designed to be a locator beacon. The signal would be detectable by someone with the right equipment, even through significant amounts of rock and earth. It's essentially a homing beacon for this location." That made a chilling kind of sense. Someone had placed this device here to mark this location, to be able to find this specific cave chamber again even years later, even if the entrance became obscured. But why? What was so important about this particular location? The answer to that question would require exploring the chamber more thoroughly. And what the forensic team found would finally explain what happened to Sarah Morrison. Because this cave chamber wasn't just where evidence had been hidden. It was where Sarah Morrison had been brought after her disappearance. It was the last place she'd been alive. The chamber, which investigators began calling Morrison's Rest in their reports, underwent the most thorough forensic examination imaginable. Every square inch was documented, sampled, analyzed. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was a time capsule, sealed away for 22 years, preserving evidence that might finally answer what happened to Sarah Morrison. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in to scan the chamber floor. If Sarah's remains were buried here, the radar would detect the disturbance in the soil and rock. The scans revealed several areas of interest, places where the natural layering of sediment appeared disrupted. Carefully, over the course of several days, forensic anthropologists excavated these areas. The work was painstaking, using small tools, brushes, and sifting screens to ensure no evidence was lost. And on June 12, 2023, they found her. Sarah Morrison's skeletal remains were discovered buried beneath approximately 18 inches of loose rock and soil in a corner of the chamber. Her green hiking backpack was with her, along with her art supplies, her water bottles, and her personal effects. After 22 years, Sarah had been found. The discovery brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief to the Morrison family. Patricia Morrison, now 73 years old, wept when Detective Chun called with the news. "We can bring her home," Patricia whispered. "After all these years, we can finally bring our baby home." But finding Sarah's remains was only part of the puzzle. The crucial question remained: who had done this? Who had brought Sarah Morrison to this remote cave chamber, and why? The answer lay in the forensic evidence collected from the scene. First, the bracelet. It was confirmed to be Sarah's, matching photographs from before her disappearance and identified by Patricia Morrison through the distinctive engraving. A gift from her grandmother. But here's what was significant. The bracelet hadn't been on Sarah's body. It had been deliberately placed on the ledge next to the transmitter, as if displayed. That suggested it had been removed from Sarah at some point and positioned there intentionally. Second, the transmitter itself. Forensic analysis identified the specific make and model, a specialized low-frequency communications device manufactured by a company called Underground Systems Incorporated, which had gone out of business in 2004. This wasn't off-the-shelf consumer electronics. This was specialized equipment, the kind purchased by mining companies, cave exploration teams, or serious hobbyists with technical expertise. Detective Chen's team began the tedious process of tracking down sales records for this specific model. After weeks of research, working with archived documents and contacting former employees of the defunct manufacturer, they struck gold. A sales database showing every unit sold between 1997 and 2003. One unit, sold in August 1999, had been shipped to a residential address in Asheville, North Carolina. The purchaser's name on the invoice, Robert E. Caldwell. That name appeared in the case file. 22 years earlier, Robert Eli Caldwell had been one of the volunteers in the initial search for Sarah Morrison. He'd been interviewed by Detective Reynolds, cleared, and never considered a suspect. Detective Chun immediately pulled everything they had on Caldwell. Driver's license records showed he was now 58 years old, still living in Asheville. Employment records showed he'd worked as an electronics technician for various companies over the years. His hobbies, according to social media profiles and local records, included hiking and cave exploration. He'd been a member of the Blue Ridge Caving Society since the mid-1990s. A caver with electronics expertise who'd purchased the exact type of transmitter found at the crime scene. Who'd participated in the search for Sarah Morrison, potentially using that opportunity to gauge how close investigators were getting to discovering his crime. But they needed more than circumstantial evidence. They needed proof that Caldwell had been involved in Sarah's death. The forensic team returned to Morrison's Rest with renewed purpose, looking for any trace evidence that might link Caldwell to the scene. They found it in a place they almost missed: A small, sealed chamber, hidden behind what appeared to be a naturally formed rock wall, but was actually a carefully constructed false wall. When the false wall was carefully dismantled, investigators found a secondary chamber, smaller than the main one, but containing evidence that would seal Caldwell's fate. Inside were items that clearly didn't belong in a natural cave. A camping lantern, several empty water bottles, a tarp, rope, and most damningly, a logbook. The logbook was a weatherproof notebook, the kind used by field researchers or military personnel. It contained handwritten entries spanning from September 2001 to December 2001, documenting visits to the chamber. The handwriting would later be confirmed as Robert Caldwell's. The entries were clinical, disturbing in their detachment. They described the subject being secured in the chamber. They noted observations about conditions in the cave, humidity levels, temperature readings. They mentioned the device functioning correctly and being detectable at maximum range of 3 miles with proper equipment. The entries stopped abruptly in mid-December 2001. The final entry read, "Subject expired approximately 1600 hours. Natural causes given circumstances. Will seal location and maintain beacon for future recovery if necessary." Reading those entries, Detective Chun felt sick. Sarah Morrison hadn't died immediately. She'd been held in this cave chamber, alive, for 3 months before she died of exposure, dehydration, or starvation. The horror of that realization was almost too much to bear. But the logbook provided something else. Evidence of premeditation, evidence of deliberate action, and most importantly, evidence directly linking Robert Caldwell to Sarah Morrison's death. On July 19, 2023, Detective Chun obtained an arrest warrant for Robert Elias Caldwell for the murder of Sarah Morrison. The arrest needed to be carefully planned. Caldwell had successfully hidden his crime for 22 years. He was intelligent, methodical, and potentially dangerous. If he suspected police were onto him, he might flee or destroy additional evidence. Surveillance was established on Caldwell's residence. Detectives observed his daily patterns, confirmed he was still living at the same address, monitored his movements. He appeared to be living a routine, quiet life, going to work, running errands, spending evenings at home. There was no indication he knew investigators had found Morrison's rest. On the morning of July 26, 2023, Detective Chun led a team of officers to Caldwell's home to execute the arrest warrant. It was just after dawn, a time when subjects were typically home and less likely to be alert or prepared. The street was quiet, the summer morning just beginning to warm up. 6 unmarked vehicles parked at strategic locations around Caldwell's house, blocking potential escape routes. Detectives in tactical gear positioned themselves at the front and back doors. Detective Chun knocked on the front door. "Robert Caldwell, this is the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office. We have a warrant. Open the door." There was a long silence. Then, from inside, a voice. "What's this about?" Mr. Caldwell opened the door. "Now." After another pause, the door opened. Robert Caldwell stood there in pajama pants and a faded t-shirt, blinking in the morning light. He looked older than his 58 years, gray-haired and slightly stooped, completely ordinary. He looked like someone's grandfather, not a murderer. "Robert Elias Caldwell," Detective Chun said, her voice steady and official. "You are under arrest for the murder of Sarah Morrison." For just a moment, Caldwell's face remained expressionless. Then something shifted in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps relief. "I wondered when you'd figure it out," he said quietly. "I wondered if you ever would." And just like that, after 22 years, Sarah Morrison's killer was in custody. Robert Caldwell was transported to the Buncombe County Detention Center, booked, and placed in a holding cell. Detective Chun decided to let him sit for a few hours before conducting a formal interview. Sometimes silence was the most effective interrogation technique. Let the suspect think about their situation, let the reality of their circumstances settle in, and then see if they want to talk. At 2 p.m. that afternoon, Detective Chun and her partner, Detective Michael Torres, entered the interview room. Caldwell sat at a metal table, hands folded, looking calm, almost serene. That disturbed Detective Chun more than if he'd been agitated or angry. "Mr. Caldwell," she began, starting the recording equipment. "I'm Detective Sarah Chun. This is Detective Michael Torres. You've been advised of your Miranda rights. Are you willing to speak with us?" Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. "Do I need a lawyer?" "That's your right, absolutely. But I'm hoping you might want to tell us what happened. Help us understand." Another long pause. Then Caldwell nodded slowly. "I'll talk. I'm tired of carrying it. 22 years is a long time to keep a secret." What followed was one of the most disturbing confessions Detective Chun had ever heard. Caldwell spoke calmly, almost clinically, describing his crime with the same detached precision as his logbook entries. It was clear that in his mind he'd rationalized what he'd done, constructed a narrative that made sense to him, if no one else. Caldwell explained that he'd first seen Sarah Morrison in the spring of 2001 at an art gallery downtown. He'd been immediately fascinated by her work, but more than that, by her. "She was beautiful," he said. "Not just physically. Her spirit, her passion for the mountains. I could see it in her paintings. She understood them the way I did." He began following her, learning her routines, her favorite hiking trails. "I wasn't trying to be creepy," he insisted, though the detective's expressions made clear what they thought of that claim. "I just wanted to get to know her, but I couldn't approach her normally. I'm not good at talking to people, especially women. I knew she wouldn't be interested in someone like me." So Caldwell had devised a plan, one that used his unique combination of expertise in electronics and cave exploration. He'd identified Morrison's rest years earlier while mapping cave systems in the Pisgah forest. It was remote, extremely difficult to access, and completely unknown to the general public. He'd equipped it with supplies, created the false wall to hide evidence, and installed the low-frequency transmitter so he could always find it again. "I thought if I could bring her there, spend time with her away from distractions and other people, she'd understand me. She'd see that I appreciated her art, her love of nature, that we were similar." Detective Chun fought to keep her voice level. "You kidnapped her, Mr. Caldwell. You held her prisoner in a cave." Caldwell's expression flickered. "I didn't mean to hurt her. I just wanted her to understand." He described how he'd planned Sarah's abduction meticulously. On September 15th, 2001, he'd hiked to the Big Ivy area before dawn, positioning himself off-trail where he could observe the parking area. When Sarah arrived and started hiking, he'd followed at a distance. About half a mile up the trail, at a point where the path curved around a large rock formation, Caldwell had made his move. Using a handheld electromagnetic device of his own design, he'd activated the transmitter in Morrison's rest, creating a signal that interfered with Sarah's compass and GPS unit. She stopped, confused about why her equipment wasn't working right, Caldwell recalled. "I approached her, told her I was a park ranger. I had the uniform, the equipment. I said there was a problem with unusual electromagnetic activity in the area affecting navigation equipment, and I needed to guide hikers to safety using alternative routes. She believed me." Caldwell had led Sarah off the established trail, taking her through difficult terrain that left minimal trace, using his expert knowledge of the area to avoid places where they might be seen. The route took them to Morrison's rest. Once there, the situation revealed itself for what it was, and Sarah realized she'd been deceived. What happened next was difficult for the detectives to hear. Caldwell had restrained Sarah in the cave chamber, keeping her there while he tried to make her understand his obsession. He'd bring supplies, try to talk to her about art and nature and the mountains they both loved. But Sarah, terrified and desperate, had wanted nothing to do with him. "She wouldn't listen," Caldwell said, and there was frustration in his voice, as if Sarah had been unreasonable. "She kept crying, begging to be let go. I tried to explain that I wasn't going to hurt her, but she wouldn't believe me." As the days turned to weeks and weeks to months, the situation deteriorated. Caldwell couldn't keep Sarah indefinitely without someone eventually discovering his crime. But he also couldn't bring himself to release her. She'd immediately report what he'd done. He was paralyzed by his own twisted logic. Eventually, conditions in the cave, combined with the psychological trauma of her captivity, led to Sarah's death in December 2001. Caldwell claimed she died of natural causes. Though the detectives knew the truth, Sarah Morrison had died because Robert Caldwell had kidnapped and imprisoned her, depriving her of freedom, proper nutrition, medical care, and the will to live. After Sarah died, Caldwell had buried her in the cave chamber, hidden the evidence behind the false wall, and left the transmitter running. "I thought maybe someday I'd go back," he explained. "Maybe I'd move her remains to a proper burial place. The beacon made sure I could always find the location, even if the entrance became overgrown or blocked." But he never went back. He returned to his life, participated in the search efforts to deflect suspicion, and carried his secret for 22 years. "Why are you telling us all this?" Detective Torres asked. "You could have waited for a lawyer." Refused to talk? Caldwell smiled sadly. "I'm tired, Detective. I've been carrying this for so long, looking over my shoulder, wondering when the knock on the door would come. Part of me is relieved it's finally over. Part of me wants people to understand I never meant to hurt her. I just wanted her to see me." Detective Chun leaned forward. "Mr. Caldwell, Sarah Morrison died terrified and alone in a cave because of what you did. Her family spent 22 years not knowing what happened to their daughter. You stole her life, her future, everything she could have been. I don't care what you meant to do. What you did was monstrous." Caldwell's expression closed off. "I'd like to speak to a lawyer now." The interview concluded. Caldwell's confession had been recorded, documented, and would be used against him at trial. Combined with the physical evidence from Morrison's arrest, the case against him was overwhelming. But there was still the question of the bracelet. Why had Caldwell removed it from Sarah's body and placed it next to the transmitter? In a subsequent interview with his attorney present, Caldwell answered that question. The bracelet had belonged to Sarah's grandmother. She'd told him during one of their conversations in the cave. It was precious to her. After she died, Caldwell had removed it and placed it near the transmitter as a marker, something beautiful to mark the place. In his twisted mind, it was a tribute. The psychology of someone like Robert Caldwell is difficult for normal people to understand. How does someone rationalize kidnapping and murder as expressions of admiration? How does someone convince themselves that imprisoning another human being against their will is anything other than evil? Forensic psychologists would later evaluate Caldwell, diagnosing him with several personality disorders and an extreme inability to process empathy or understand other people's autonomous existence. To Caldwell, Sarah hadn't been a real person with her own desires, fears, and rights. She'd been an object of obsession, something he wanted to possess. But none of that would matter in court. What mattered was that Robert Caldwell had kidnapped Sarah Morrison, held her prisoner, and caused her death. The legal term for that was murder. News of Caldwell's arrest exploded across western North Carolina like a thunderstorm. After 22 years of mystery, the Sarah Morrison case had been solved, and the resolution was shocking. Local media descended on the story. The Asheville Citizen-Times ran a front-page story with the headline, "Cave Signal Solves 22-Year-Old Cold Case. Local man arrested for Morrison murder." Television news crews from Charlotte, Raleigh, and even Atlanta set up outside the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office, interviewing anyone connected to the case. The community's reaction was a mixture of relief, horror, and betrayal. Eli Caldwell had lived among them for decades. He'd been their neighbor, the guy who fixed their computers, the volunteer who'd searched for Sarah Morrison alongside law enforcement. And all that time, he'd been her killer, hiding in plain sight. "I can't believe it," said Martha Henderson, who'd lived 2 houses down from Caldwell for 15 years. "He seemed so normal, so quiet. He helped me install a satellite dish last year. We chatted about the weather and hiking trails. And all that time, he'd killed that poor girl? It's terrifying. You think you know people and you don't know them at all." Others echoed similar sentiments. Caldwell had been so ordinary, so forgettable, that he'd hidden effectively behind a mask of normalcy. No one had suspected him because there was nothing to suspect, or rather, nothing visible. The monster had been internal, carefully concealed behind a bland exterior. For the Morrison family, the arrest brought complex emotions. Relief that the mystery was finally solved, that they knew what had happened to Sarah. Grief reopening like a fresh wound, knowing the details of her final months. Anger at Caldwell, at the justice system that hadn't caught him sooner, at the cruel randomness of their daughter crossing paths with a predator. Michael Morrison, now 76 years old and in declining health, released a statement through the family's attorney. After 22 years of questions, we finally have answers. While nothing can bring Sarah back, knowing that her killer has been caught brings some measure of peace. We are grateful to the investigators who never gave up on Sarah's case, and to the geological team whose discovery made this resolution possible. Sarah can finally rest, and so can we. Patricia Morrison was less restrained. In a televised interview, she looked directly at the camera and said, "Robert Caldwell stole our daughter from us. He stole her future, her art, all the joy she would have brought to this world. He doesn't deserve forgiveness, and I hope he spends the rest of his life thinking about what he did, feeling even a fraction of the pain he's caused our family." The Blue Ridge Caving Society, of which Caldwell had been a long-time member, released a statement condemning his actions and expressing sympathy for the Morrison family. They cooperated fully with investigators, providing records of Caldwell's caving activities and any information that might be relevant to the case. Dr. Amanda Reeves, whose geological team had discovered Morrison's rest, gave interviews about the discovery. "We were just doing routine geological survey work," she explained. "Finding that signal, that cave, Sarah's remains. It was completely unexpected, but I'm grateful that our work could bring closure to the Morrison family. It reminds me that science isn't just about advancing knowledge. Sometimes it's about bringing justice and peace to people who desperately need it." The discovery and arrest sparked renewed interest in other cold cases throughout the region. Families of missing persons reached out to law enforcement, asking if similar new technologies or approaches might help solve their cases. The Sarah Morrison case became an example of why cold cases should never be considered truly closed, why advances in technology and persistent investigation could still yield results decades after a crime. But there was also criticism. Some asked why Caldwell had been cleared so easily in the initial investigation. Why had a volunteer in the search, someone with expert knowledge of the area's caves, not been scrutinized more thoroughly? Could Sarah Morrison have been found sooner if investigators had looked more carefully at the people involved in searching for her? Detective Marcus Reynolds, now retired and in his 70s, addressed these questions in an interview. "I've thought about this case every day since I worked it," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Could we have done things differently? Maybe. With hindsight, everything looks clearer. But at the time, we had no reason to suspect Caldwell more than any other volunteer. He was cooperative, seemed genuinely concerned, had no obvious connection to Sarah. We investigated every lead we had, and those leads didn't point to him." Reynolds continued, "What I want people to understand is that investigations are conducted in real time, without the benefit of knowing how things will turn out. We make the best decisions we can with the information available. Could modern technology and techniques have caught Caldwell sooner? Probably. But we did our jobs to the best of our ability with what we had. I'm just grateful the case was finally solved, and that Sarah's family has closure." The legal process moved forward quickly. Caldwell's confession, combined with the overwhelming physical evidence, made the prosecution's job straightforward. His defense attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the district attorney's office refused. Sarah Morrison's case was too high-profile, the crime too heinous. This was going to trial. The trial date was set for January 2024, giving both sides time to prepare their cases. The community waited anxiously, wanting to see justice fully served. The trial of Robert Elias Caldwell began on January 22, 2024, in Buncombe County Superior Court. Judge Catherine Brennan presiding. The courtroom was packed with media, members of the public, and most importantly, the Morrison family, who sat in the front row, ready to finally see justice for Sarah. Caldwell's defense team, led by public defender Thomas Garrett, faced an uphill battle. Their client had confessed. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The best they could hope for was to mitigate the charges, perhaps argue for second-degree murder rather than first-degree, claimed diminished capacity due to mental illness. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Rachel Montgomery, had a clear strategy: present the evidence methodically, establish premeditation and deliberate action, and let Caldwell's own words condemn him. Opening statements laid out the starkly different narratives. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Eddie Montgomery began, her voice clear and strong. "This is a case about obsession, entitlement, and murder." The defendant, Robert Caldwell, became obsessed with Sarah Morrison. Rather than accept that his interest was one-sided, rather than respect her autonomy as a human being, he decided to take her. He meticulously planned her abduction, using his expertise in electronics and cave exploration to create an undetectable prison. He lured her off a hiking trail using deception, imprisoned her in a remote cave for 3 months, and ultimately caused her death. Then, he hid his crime so effectively it took 22 years to discover. This was not an impulsive act. This was calculated, premeditated murder. And the evidence will prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Robert Caldwell is guilty. Defense attorney Garrett took a different approach. "What happened to Sarah Morrison is a tragedy, and my client recognizes that. But this is not a case of first-degree murder. My client never intended to kill Sarah Morrison. He made catastrophically poor decisions, driven by mental illness and an inability to process social relationships normally. This is a case of false imprisonment that resulted in unintended death. Robert Caldwell's actions were wrong, but they were not murder in the first degree. The evidence will show that while my client bears responsibility for Sarah's death, he did not murder her with premeditation and malice." The prosecution began presenting evidence. Detective Sarah Chun testified about the discovery of Morrison's rest, walking the jury through photographs of the cave, the transmitter, Sarah's bracelet, her remains. The testimony was emotional, especially when photographs of Sarah's skeletal remains were shown. Several jurors looked away. Patricia Morrison wept quietly. Dr. Amanda Reeves testified about how her geological team had discovered the electromagnetic signal and what that discovery had led to. Her testimony established the timeline and the unusual circumstances that had finally cracked the case. Forensic experts testified about the analysis of the transmitter, the logbook, the handwriting analysis that confirmed Caldwell had written the entries documenting Sarah's imprisonment. Each piece of evidence was methodically presented, building an irrefutable case. The most damning evidence was Caldwell's own confession. The recording of his interview with Detective Chun was played for the jury. Hearing Caldwell describe in his own words how he'd planned Sarah's abduction, how he'd deceived her, how he'd imprisoned her, the impact was devastating. His clinical tone, his lack of remorse, his insistence that he'd never meant to hurt her, while describing actions that could only result in harm. It painted a picture of someone fundamentally disconnected from reality and basic human empathy. A forensic psychologist, Dr. Elena Vasquez, testified for the prosecution about Caldwell's psychological evaluation. Yes, Caldwell had personality disorders. Yes, he had difficulty with empathy and social processing. But none of that rose to the level of legal insanity or diminished capacity. Caldwell had known what he was doing was wrong. His elaborate efforts to hide the crime proved that. He'd made calculated decisions to deceive, abduct, and imprison Sarah Morrison. His mental issues might explain his motivations, but they didn't excuse his actions. The defense presented their own psychological expert, who argued that Caldwell's mental state should be considered a mitigating factor. But under cross-examination, even this expert had to admit that Caldwell had been legally competent when he committed his crimes. The defense tried to establish that Sarah's death had not been intentional, that Caldwell had provided food and water, that he hadn't actively tried to kill her. But the prosecution countered effectively. Imprisoning someone in a cave, depriving them of freedom, medical care, and contact with the outside world was inherently life-threatening. Whether Caldwell had actively murdered Sarah or merely created the conditions that led to her death was a distinction without a meaningful difference. One of the most powerful moments of the trial came when Michael Morrison took the stand. At 76, frail but determined, he testified about Sarah, about what kind of person she'd been, about the hole her disappearance had left in their lives. For 22 years, Michael said, his voice shaking but steady. I wondered if Sarah was alive somewhere, suffering, needing help that I couldn't give her. I wondered if she called out for me, for her mother, in whatever dark place she was. I wondered if she knew how hard we were looking for her, how we never gave up. Now I know the truth. I know she spent her final months imprisoned by that man, he pointed at Caldwell, who looked down at the defense table. Terrified and alone, slowly dying in the dark. I know she called out and no one came. That knowledge is almost harder to bear than not knowing. Michael paused, gathering himself. But I also know that Sarah fought to survive as long as she could. The forensic evidence showed she tried to escape, tried to dig through rock with her bare hands. My daughter was strong. She was brave. She didn't give up, even when she had every reason to. And now, finally, we can honor her memory with justice. That's all we're asking. Justice for Sarah. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. The defense called Caldwell to testify on his own behalf, a risky move but one they felt necessary to humanize him. Caldwell took the stand and, under his attorney's questioning, repeated his story. He expressed regret for Sarah's death, insisted he'd never intended to harm her, claimed he'd been driven by mental illness he couldn't control. But under ADA Montgomery's cross-examination, Caldwell's defense crumbled. Mr. Caldwell, Montgomery asked, when you purchased the low-frequency transmitter in 1999, 2 years before you abducted Sarah Morrison, what did you intend to use it for? Caldwell hesitated. Cave exploration. Marking locations. Marking locations of what? Interesting cave systems I'd discovered. But you didn't mark them, did you? In fact, you only installed one transmitter in the cave where you would later imprison Sarah Morrison. You purchased that equipment 2 years in advance of your crime. That suggests planning, doesn't it? I suppose. But I didn't know Sarah then. When did you first see Sarah Morrison? Spring of 2001. So you purchased specialized equipment 2 years before you even met your victim. Were you planning to abduct someone else? Or did you have this equipment ready, waiting for the right target? Caldwell had no good answer to that. His claim of impulsive, unplanned action driven by mental illness was undermined by evidence of extensive preparation. Montgomery continued, when you led Sarah Morrison off the trail, you were wearing a park ranger uniform. Where did you get that uniform? I made it, based on photos. You created a fake park ranger uniform. That's premeditation, isn't it? That's planning. I wasn't thinking clearly. You were thinking clearly enough to create a disguise, to plan an abduction route, to prepare a secret prison, to install equipment to help you find it again. You thought very clearly, Mr. Caldwell. You just didn't care about Sarah Morrison's rights, her safety, or her life. Isn't that the truth? Caldwell's composure finally broke. I cared about her. I loved her. I just wanted her to understand. Love doesn't imprison, Mr. Caldwell. Love doesn't kidnap. Love doesn't create conditions that lead to death. What you felt wasn't love. It was obsession, entitlement, and ultimately murder. The cross-examination destroyed whatever sympathy Caldwell might have generated. The jury saw him for what he was, a calculated predator who'd meticulously planned his crime and then tried to excuse it with claims of mental illness. Closing arguments reinforced these narratives. The prosecution summarized the overwhelming evidence of premeditation and deliberate action. The defense pleaded for mercy, for recognition of Caldwell's mental state. But the damage was done. Judge Brennan gave the jury their instructions, explaining the legal standards for first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and lesser charges. She explained the concept of reasonable doubt and the burden of proof resting on the prosecution. On February 3, 2024, after 8 hours of deliberation over 2 days, the jury returned with their verdict. On all counts, guilty. First-degree murder, kidnapping, false imprisonment. Robert Elias Caldwell was convicted of murdering Sarah Morrison. The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later, on February 17, 2024. In North Carolina, first-degree murder carries either life without parole or the death penalty. Given the circumstances of the case, the premeditation, the extended imprisonment, the suffering Sarah endured, the prosecution had pushed for the death penalty. But the Morrison family had requested otherwise. "We don't want Caldwell to become a martyr or a cause," Patricia Morrison explained in a statement. "We don't want appeals and legal battles extending for another 20 years. We want him locked away for the rest of his natural life, forgotten, irrelevant. That's what he deserves." Judge Brennan considered all the factors: the heinousness of the crime, Caldwell's lack of genuine remorse, the impact on the victim's family, and the Morrison family's wishes. She then delivered her sentence. "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Brennan said, looking directly at the defendant, "I have presided over many criminal cases in my career, but few have disturbed me as deeply as this one. You identified a young woman, Sarah Morrison, as an object of your obsession. Rather than accept that your interest was unwelcome and one-sided, you planned and executed an elaborate scheme to abduct her. You held her prisoner in conditions designed to break her will and spirit. You watched her suffer and decline over months, and you did nothing to help her or release her. When she died, you hid her body and your crime, living freely for 22 years while her family suffered the agony of not knowing." The judge continued, "You have shown no genuine remorse. You continue to frame your actions as expressions of admiration rather than the violent crimes they were. You demonstrated in your testimony a fundamental inability to recognize Sarah Morrison as a human being with autonomy and rights equal to your own. You are a danger to society and cannot be rehabilitated." Judge Brennan pronounced sentence. "For the murder of Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, you are sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the kidnapping, an additional 20 years to be served consecutively. You will spend the remainder of your life in the North Carolina Department of Corrections. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court has none." Caldwell showed no reaction. He was led out of the courtroom in shackles, beginning his journey to spend the rest of his life behind bars. But the sentencing hearing wasn't over. Under North Carolina law, the victim's family had the right to present impact statements before the court. This was their opportunity to speak directly about how the crime had affected them. Patricia Morrison approached the podium first. At 73, she looked both fragile and fierce, grief and determination etched into every line of her face. 22 years, she began, her voice soft but carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. 22 years of not knowing, of wondering if my daughter was alive somewhere, calling for help that never came, of looking at every young woman on the street and thinking, could that be Sarah? Of leaving her room exactly as she left it because I couldn't accept that she was never coming home. 22 years of half-lived life, of joy tempered by constant grief, of birthdays and holidays marked by her absence. Patricia's voice grew stronger. Robert Caldwell took my daughter from me. He took her life, her future, her art that would never be created, her children that would never be born. He took our family's happiness and replaced it with an emptiness that can never be filled. He did this not in a moment of passion or rage, but through calculated, deliberate action. He planned to hurt her, and he succeeded beyond measure. She looked directly at Caldwell. I don't forgive you. I will never forgive you. But I don't need to forgive you to move forward. You are nothing to me now. You're just a sad, broken man who will die in a prison cell, unloved and unremembered. Sarah's memory, her art, her spirit, those will live on. You'll be forgotten. And that's exactly what you deserve. Patricia returned to her seat, where Michael embraced her. Then Daniel Morrison, Sarah's brother, took the podium. I was 20 years old when my sister disappeared, Daniel said. I'm 43 now. I've lived more than half my life without her. I got married, she wasn't there. I had children, she never met them. I named my daughter after her, trying to keep her memory alive, trying to make sure my kids knew about the aunt they'd never know. Daniel's voice cracked with emotion. The hardest part was not knowing. Were we looking in the right place? Had we given up too soon? Should we have done more? That guilt, that uncertainty, it eats at you. Now we know. Now we know Sarah spent her final months in hell, imprisoned and suffering, slowly dying. That knowledge brings closure, but God, it hurts. It hurts so much. He composed himself. But I'm also grateful. Grateful to the investigators who never gave up. Grateful to the geological team who found her. Grateful that my parents got to see justice before their time comes. Sarah's story has an ending now. It's not the ending we wanted, but it's an ending. She's no longer lost. She's no longer alone in the dark. We brought her home, and now she rests in peace beside her grandmother, in the place she belongs. Daniel paused, then added, to anyone out there with a missing loved one, don't give up hope. Keep pushing. Keep advocating. Technology advances. Evidence gets reevaluated. Sometimes, against all odds, answers come. Sarah's case proves that. No case is ever truly cold. The impact statements concluded. The court adjourned. The Morrison family stepped out into the late winter sunshine, blinking in the bright light after the courtroom's fluorescence. Media surrounded them immediately, but Michael Morrison raised a hand. We have a brief statement, he said. We are grateful that Sarah's case has been solved and that her killer has been brought to justice. We thank the investigators, prosecutors, and everyone who worked tirelessly to find the truth. Sarah can rest now, and so can we. We ask for privacy as we grieve and heal. Thank you. They walked away, a family that had spent 22 years in limbo, finally able to move forward. The weight they'd carried for so long had been lifted, replaced by a different kind of grief, the grief of knowing, of closure, of endings. Robert Caldwell was transported to Central Prison in Raleigh, where he would spend the rest of his life. In a strange twist, he would be just another inmate, his notoriety fading as the news cycle moved on to other stories. He would die in obscurity, exactly as Patricia Morrison had predicted. The Sarah Morrison case had ripple effects far beyond one family's closure. First, it revolutionized how investigators approach cold cases in wilderness areas. The use of electromagnetic scanning and advanced geological survey techniques to locate hidden evidence became a new tool in the cold case investigation toolkit. Several other jurisdictions reached out to Detective Chun and Dr. Reeves, asking for consultations on similar cases where victims had disappeared in remote areas. In Kentucky, a 16-year-old missing person case was reopened using similar scanning techniques. In Montana, investigators began surveying areas where suspected victims of a serial killer might have been hidden. In Tennessee, a decade-old disappearance case used LiDAR mapping to identify previously unknown cave systems in the search area. While not all these efforts yielded results, the Sarah Morrison case proved that technology could provide answers even decades after a crime. Second, the case led to policy changes in how search and rescue volunteers are vetted and monitored. The fact that Caldwell had participated in the search for his own victim, potentially using that access to gauge how close investigators were getting, was deeply disturbing to law enforcement. New protocols were developed to screen volunteers more carefully and track their activities during searches. Third, Sarah Morrison's story inspired advocacy for missing persons cases and improved resources for families navigating the nightmare of having a loved one vanish. The Sarah Morrison Memorial Fund, originally established by her family as a reward fund, was converted into a nonprofit organization providing support services to families of missing persons, funding advanced search technologies, and advocating for policy changes. Patricia Morrison, despite her advanced age, became a voice for these families. She spoke at conferences, testified before legislative committees, and connected with other families who understood her pain. No one should have to go through what we went through, she said in interviews. If Sarah's case can help even one other family find their loved one, then some meaning comes from this tragedy. The case also sparked discussions about the nature of obsession, mental illness, and violence. Forensic psychologists studied Caldwell's case as an example of how certain personality disorders, when combined with entitlement and lack of empathy, could escalate into extreme violence. Universities used the case in criminal psychology courses, examining how Caldwell's obsession with Sarah had progressed from admiration to possession to murder. In Asheville, the case transformed the community's relationship with their beloved mountains. The wilderness had always been seen as a place of beauty and recreation, but Sarah's case reminded everyone that nature could hide darkness. Hikers became more cautious, more likely to hike in groups, more diligent about telling others their plans. The Big Ivy Trailhead, where Sarah had last been seen alive, became a memorial site, with hikers leaving flowers, painted rocks, and notes honoring her memory. The art community in Asheville held a retrospective of Sarah Morrison's work in the spring of 2024. Paintings that had been in storage, her unfinished sketches, even her hiking journals with their margin drawings. All were displayed in a gallery show called Mountains of Light, the Art of Sarah Morrison. The show was deeply moving, revealing the talent that had been silenced too soon. Several of her pieces sold for significant amounts, with proceeds going to the memorial fund. Local artists also created new works inspired by Sarah's story. A sculptor created a memorial piece installed near the Blue Ridge Parkway, a bronze figure of a young woman with a sketch pad, gazing out at the mountains she'd loved. A composer wrote a symphonic piece called Signal from the Mountain, which premiered with the Asheville Symphony. Poets, painters, and writers all found ways to honor Sarah's memory and process the tragedy of her loss. For the geological community, the case highlighted how scientific research could have unexpected consequences beyond academic knowledge. Dr. Amanda Reeves and her team received recognition for their role in solving the case, but they remained humble about it. "We were just doing our work," Dr. Reeves said. The fact that it led to solving a cold case was serendipity, but it's a reminder that science serves humanity in many ways, some we don't anticipate. The case also affected how people think about the passage of time and justice. 22 years is a generation. People had been born, grown up, and become adults in the time between Sarah's disappearance and the resolution of her case. It seemed impossible that a crime could remain hidden for so long, yet it had. The case proved that justice, though sometimes agonizingly slow, could still arrive. For cold case investigators across the country, the Morrison case became a beacon of hope. It proved that cases could be solved decades after the fact, that advances in technology could crack seemingly unsolvable mysteries, that persistence and careful investigation could yield results even when all seemed lost. Detective Sarah Chun, who'd led the modern investigation, reflected on the case's impact in a conference presentation to other cold case investigators. "What Sarah Morrison's case teaches us is that we should never give up," she said. "Evidence doesn't disappear. It just waits to be found. Technology improves. New witnesses come forward. Criminals make mistakes. Our job is to keep pushing, keep investigating, keep looking at cases from new angles. Because somewhere, there's a family like the Morrisons waiting for answers, and we owe it to them to never stop searching." The case also sparked interest in other unsolved disappearances in national forests and wilderness areas across the United States. True crime podcasters, documentary filmmakers, and journalists examined similar cases, wondering if any might be solved using techniques similar to those that cracked the Morrison case. While most disappearances in wilderness areas are genuinely accidents or misadventures, Sarah's case reminded everyone that sometimes the answer is more sinister. One unexpected legacy of the case was increased interest in cave exploration and mapping. The fact that Morrison's rest had been completely undocumented, unknown to officials, and essentially invisible to standard search efforts highlighted how much of the American wilderness remains unmapped and unexplored. Geological organizations received increased funding to conduct comprehensive surveys of cave systems, creating databases that could help both researchers and law enforcement. As years pass, Sarah Morrison's case will likely be remembered as a watershed moment in cold case investigation. The case where technology, persistence, and a bit of luck combined to bring justice after more than 2 decades. Her story will be told in forensic textbooks, true crime documentaries, and investigative training courses. And through those retellings, Sarah herself will be remembered not just as a victim, but as a talented artist, a loving daughter and sister, a passionate hiker who loved the mountains, a real person whose life had value and whose loss created ripples that touched countless others. So that's the story of Sarah Morrison and the Signal from the Mountains. A cold case that remained unsolved for 22 years until an impossible discovery deep underground finally revealed the truth. Think about what this case teaches us. It teaches us that justice, though sometimes delayed, can still arrive. that families who refuse to give up, who keep advocating for their loved ones, can make a difference. That advances in technology can solve mysteries that seemed unsolvable. That sometimes the mountains do give up their secrets. But more than that, Sarah Morrison's case reminds us of something fundamental about cold cases. They're not just files and archives or mysteries to be solved. They're real people whose lives were cut short, families whose suffering continues year after year, communities forever changed by tragedy. Behind every cold case is a Sarah Morrison. Someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend, someone who deserved better than they got. The resolution of this case brought closure to the Morrison family. But closure isn't the same as healing. Patricia and Michael Morrison will carry their grief for the rest of their lives. Daniel Morrison will always wonder who his sister might have become. But at least now they know. At least now Sarah rests in peace, her memory honored, her killer brought to justice. For other families with missing loved ones, Sarah's case offers hope. It proves that cases can be solved decades later. It proves that investigators don't give up, that evidence can still be found, that answers are possible even when they seem impossible. If you're listening to this and you have a missing loved one, don't lose hope. Keep advocating. Keep pushing. Keep their memory alive. Because somewhere, in some case file with some piece of evidence not yet discovered, there might be an answer waiting. This case also reminds us to be aware of the people around us. Robert Caldwell hid in plain sight for decades, an ordinary-seeming man concealing a monstrous crime. Most people are exactly who they appear to be, but some aren't. If something feels wrong, if someone makes you uncomfortable, trust your instincts. And if you see something suspicious, report it. You might save a life. You might help solve a case. You might bring a family the answers they desperately need. The mountains of western North Carolina remain beautiful, drawing millions of visitors each year to hike their trails, admire their vistas, and find peace in their ancient presence. But now, when locals look at those mountains, they remember Sarah Morrison. They remember that beauty can hide darkness. They remember to be careful, to watch out for each other, to stay aware. And somewhere in those mountains, near the Blue Ridge Parkway, there's a bronze statue of a young woman with a sketch pad, capturing the light on the mountainside. It's a memorial to Sarah Morrison, but it's also a reminder of all the missing, all the lost, all those whose stories are still waiting to be told. If you have any information about unsolved cases in your area, please contact your local law enforcement. If you have a missing loved one, reach out to organizations that support families of the missing. If you're hiking in remote areas, tell someone where you're going and when you'll be back. These simple actions can make all the difference. Sarah Morrison's case is closed. Her killer is in prison where he belongs. Her family has the closure they sought for 22 years. Justice, delayed but not denied, has been served. Rest in peace, Sarah Elizabeth Morrison. Your art lives on. Your memory endures. You are not forgotten. This has been the story of the Asheville 2001 cold case, the signal from the mountains, and the extraordinary resolution that shocked a community and brought peace to a grieving family. Thank you for listening. Until next time, remember, no case is ever truly cold, and justice, though sometimes slow, never stops searching.